Let's rewind. Just one day before this hearing, the Department of Justice arraigned a former FBI director for making false statements to the very same committee. Think about that. One day later, the Attorney General of the United States sits in that same chair and, according to Senator Whitehouse, does exactly what that former FBI director was just charged for, making false statements to Congress.
To me, yesterday was an awful day in the history of this committee. It set new low after new low after new low. And I'm not going to talk about all of the new lows. I'm going to talk about one in particular. And that is whether anybody noticed the irony that the day before the United States Department of Justice arraigned a former FBI director for allegedly making untruthful statements to this committee, the Attorney General of the United States sat right there and made untruthful statements to this committee. And they weren't maybe untruthful statements. This wasn't a question of nuance. She made allegations about the ranking member and me having received political contributions from some, she said, Epstein close confidant. Well, guess what? That's actually checkable. There's a thing called the Federal Election Commission. The Federal Election Commission keeps a website that tracks all of our contributions. An intern at the Department of Justice could have checked to see that the allegation, I'll leave it to myself, that I had received campaign contributions from this individual, that was false. And it's not a maybe answer. It's a yes or no. Did I or didn't I? And there's an unimpeachable record that shows that what she said sitting right there was not true. If we are going to care about untruthful statements made by the Department of Justice and the FBI in this committee, let's not have this be yet another area where there are different rules for one party than for the other party. And just by the way, on that very subject, the other thing that the Attorney General did sitting right there was to strip all cover away from the untruthful statements that had been made to this committee by the current FBI director. You all heard him here. He said that he couldn't tell us about his grand jury testimony in the Mar-a-Lago case, where he first pled the Fifth, then got immunity, and then testified. He couldn't tell us what he testified to, he said, because the Department of Justice had sealed the testimony and because there was a court order barring him from doing that. And he actually identified which judge, the chief judge of the D.C. Federal District Court. Well, guess what? We know that since then, the chief judge of the Federal District Court has said that that was not true. He said specifically nothing prevented Director Patel from discussing his grand jury testimony. And yesterday, the Attorney General had the chance to say, you're right. We did seal the testimony in that matter. The Department of Justice did seal the testimony, and Patel's statement was true. Not about the court order, but at least it was sealed by the Department of Justice. She didn't say that. So now both his testimony that the DOJ had sealed his testimony and his testimony that there was a court order barring his testimony are kind of demonstrably false statements to this committee. And then when he came back and we challenged him on those false statements, his second false statement was to say, I'm not going to answer any of those questions because my transcript of the grand jury testimony, I've worked with the DOJ to see that it is publicly released. Well, it either has been publicly released or it hasn't. It's a very simple distinction, yes or no. And we all know that it has not, in fact, been publicly released. And when we asked about that from the Attorney General, again, she left him high and dry and refused to say that anything had been publicly released, that there was any publicly released transcript. So yesterday stands in really stark contrast. I should say the day before yesterday stands in really stark contrast to yesterday. Yesterday, an FBI director was arraigned for making a false statement. The day before that, the Attorney General of the United States made arguably even falser statements. We'll see how the other case turns out. And she left the current FBI director completely exposed on his multiple false statements that his grand jury testimony in the Mar-a-Lago case had been sealed by the department, was under court order not to be released, and had since been publicly released as a transcript. I don't know if this committee is going to take itself seriously enough to treat false statements to this committee as serious matters, irrespective of who made them. But the contrast is really stark. Thank you, Chairman.
You know, sometimes you watch a Senate hearing and it feels like political theater, loud, performative, but ultimately harmless. But then there are moments that actually shake the foundation of public trust. What Senator Sheldon Whitehouse called an awful day in the history of this committee was one of those moments. And if you care about truth, transparency, and how justice operates in America, you should pay attention to this one. Because what happened here wasn't just partisanship. It was about honesty and what it means when even the nation's top law enforcement official, the Attorney General, walks into Congress and appears to lie on the record. Now, Senator Whitehouse isn't a man who tosses words like untruthful around lightly. He's meticulous. He does his homework. So when he says Bondi's statements were demonstrably false, that's not bluster. That's verifiable. For instance, Bondi claimed that Senator Whitehouse and another member had taken campaign contributions from someone she described as an Epstein confidant. But here's the thing. That's the kind of claim that's easy to check. The Federal Election Commission tracks every dollar of political contributions. And as Whitehouse pointed out, even an intern could have looked that up and seen it wasn't true. Yet the Attorney General of the United States said it anyway, on camera, under oath, to the American people. And this is where it gets deeper and darker. Because this isn't just about one false claim. It's about what that kind of dishonesty does to the credibility of the Department of Justice itself. If you remember, this hearing followed a series of controversies, claims of DOJ overreach, politically motivated investigations, selective prosecutions. Whitehouse's outrage wasn't just political grandstanding. It was a call-out of what he sees as a double standard. Republicans demanding accountability for Democrats, but brushing off their own side's misconduct. He drew a line right there in the chamber. If lying to Congress is a crime for one person, it should be a crime for everyone. And then there's the issue of the FBI director, who, according to Whitehouse, made multiple false statements about sealed testimony in the Mar-a-Lago case, saying he was barred from speaking about it by a court order that, it turns out, didn't exist. The judge involved later clarified there was no such restriction. That's not a small mistake. That's a fundamental misrepresentation to Congress. Yet, when Senator Whitehouse pressed Attorney General Bondi to clarify whether the DOJ had sealed that testimony, she refused to confirm or deny it. She left her own FBI director hanging out to dry. No correction, no clarification, nothing. And here's the bigger point. When top officials play games with the truth, it sends a message to everyone watching that power protects itself, that accountability is conditional, and that honesty in government is optional. That's what made this, as Whitehouse said, an awful day in the history of this committee. You could feel the frustration in his words, not just at Bondi, but at what it means when institutions meant to safeguard justice become political shields. We're watching a Justice Department that's supposed to be blind, that's supposed to uphold the same standards no matter who's in power, stumble into partisanship and evasion. And Whitehouse, a former U.S. attorney himself, knows exactly what that erosion looks like from the inside. So what's the takeaway here? It's this. Truth in government isn't supposed to be negotiable. Whether you're a senator, a president, or an attorney general, your word under oath matters. Because once lying becomes normalized in the halls of power, democracy doesn't just get weaker, it starts to rot. So the next time you hear someone call an oversight hearing political theater, remember this one. Because this wasn't theater. This was a mirror. And what it reflected wasn't pretty. I'll say it again. This was an awful day for the committee, yes, but more importantly, it was an awful day for the idea that truth still has a place in American government. If you believe that integrity in our justice system matters, not for Democrats or Republicans, but for everyone, don't just scroll past moments like this. Share them, talk about them, ask the hard questions. Democracy depends on it.